Welcome back. In this session we're going to look at the area of rent reviews. So, following previous sessions, here is an example of a rent review clause within a lease. So take a couple of minutes to read through this. So what this is saying is that in this particular lease, the tenant will start out paying a rent at commencement of the lease, but on the expiry of 3 years, the rent will be reviewed, and it will be reviewed to the higher of either the rent that was previously being paid. So if the tenant started out paying a rent of £50,000, then it will be the higher of £50,000, or the market rent of the premises at the relevant rent review date. So when you get to the rent review date, in this instance, the landlord will be able to review the rent to either a higher rent, which would be the market rent of the premises, and if the market rent isn't higher than the rent that they're currently paying, then the rent will be reviewed to the rent that they're currently paying. Hopefully that makes sense. So what's the purpose of a rent review? Well, essentially it's to protect the landlord's income stream from the effects of inflation. And going back quite a few decades, it was quite common for landlords to grant fairly long leases, 25, 35 years, and initially they didn't reflect the fact that over that period of time the rents might increase with inflation, so they were left with the rent being paid at a constant rate. So the landlord was actually losing out from benefiting from the increase in rents in the marketplace. So the concept of the rent review came into place. And that meant that during a lease, so if it was, for example, a 9-year lease, at the start of the lease a rent would be set, but then every 3 years, so at years 3 and then 6, the landlord would have the opportunity to review the rent to rent current at those dates in 3 years' time and in 6 years' time, so it protects them from inflation. With rent reviews, the rent review is governed by the clause of the lease, and that will set out the timetable and the mechanism for how you instigate the rent review and how you actually determine the rent that's to be payable on rent review. What's also important is that the rent payable on review is dependent on other terms of the lease, or can be dependent on other terms of the lease that could have an impact on value. And particularly relevant would be the user clause, which we've covered, the alienation clause, and then the repair clause. So if it's a particularly restrictive user clause, so it restricts it to quite a narrow use, it can be argued against the landlord at rent review that that would depress the value of the rent, because there would be fewer people in the marketplace competing for the property, because you've got to assume that it's going to be let on the terms of the lease that's being granted. So if it restricts it and there's no right to change the use, then that could have a depressing effect on the rent at rent review. There's a process that should be followed with the rent reviews. So whether you're acting for the landlord or the tenant, and it's first of all understanding what does the lease specify. So what does the lease say about the rent review? And sorry, what I should say is it may be that there is no provision for review of the rent in the lease because it's a fairly short lease. So in which case you don't need to worry about rent reviews. But where it's kind of for a term of 5, 6, 7 years or more, it's likely there would be a rent review provision in the lease. So what does the lease actually say, and what's the rent to be determined at? Understanding the relevance of the other lease clauses, I talked about user alienation, how that can impact on the rent that you assess at rent review. Interestingly, when I was in practice, lots of debate and disagreement at rent review on things like the size of the property, because the rent is calculated based on the floor area and a rate per square foot is applied to that floor area. More often than not, leases don't specify the floor area of a property, so it comes to a rent review and the landlord will measure and calculate the floor area, and the tenant will measure and calculate the floor area, or indeed their respective agents. And quite often there can be lots of initial kind of discussion and negotiation around agreeing what is the actual floor area of this property. So it's really important that you agree the floor area. May sound a little bit petty, but every square foot is critical and will impact on ultimately the rental value at rent review. So an extra 10 square feet at £100 a square foot, you can see starts to have a significant impact on the rent that would be payable. So agreeing the floor area. Then it's about understanding, okay, so at rent review, what have we got to do? We've got to assess what rent a willing landlord would pay to a willing tenant for the property, assuming it was empty and available to rent in the marketplace as at the date of the rent review. So it's all hypothetical because the tenant's still in occupation, but you've got to assume that it's vacant, available to let, and you've got a willing landlord and willing tenant. What rent would they agree for that property? So clearly one of the things that you need to understand is, what are other properties letting for at around the date of the review? Have there been other rent reviews on similar properties around the date of review? So what do their rents equate to in terms of rate per square foot? And understanding and establishing the strongest and weakest comparables, because no two properties are identical. It's a little bit easier if you've got floors within an office building and you know that the floor above has just let out close to the rent review date at, for example, £30 a square foot. You know that that's fairly direct comparable evidence. But often you don't have that direct comparable evidence, and it's a case of making adjustments to the evidence that you do have. So how close was the letting or the transaction to the rent review date that you're working to? Have rents been going up or down even between the date of that transaction and your rent review date? So do you need to make some adjustments to reflect that? Is the property, the comparable property, bigger than your property? So do you need to make an adjustment for that? Because it's always argued that you start to get a discount the more space you take. So is it larger? Is it smaller? Do you need to make adjustments? And are there any differences in lease terms that you'd need to make adjustments for? So it's about really understanding what the evidence is out there that would apply to your property to help determine what the rent should be at rent review date. And it's about making those adjustments. So normally what would happen is that the landlord would serve notice on the tenant to initiate the rent review, and again, it depends on what the lease says in terms of tenant's counter notice. The tenant, normally I would say as a tenant, objects to what the landlord is proposing, because the situation is it's a negotiation. So the landlord will ordinarily go in as a higher rent that they are probably prepared to settle at, to allow some room for negotiation. As a tenant, if you're going to make an offer, you'd make an offer lower than the rent that you're prepared to settle at. It's a negotiation scenario. Fascinating to kind of observe rent review negotiations with the landlord arguing for a higher rent using the best comparables, and the tenant that would support a high rent, and the tenant arguing for the lowest rent possible using the best comparables that would support a low rent. So very much about the negotiation, but be aware in terms of notices. Sometimes within a lease there is reference to time being of the essence. So if time is of the essence, then a tenant has to be very, very careful, because the landlord can specify a rent in a notice that they serve on the tenant. And if time is deemed to be of the essence, the tenant has a set time in which to respond, and if they fail to respond within that time frame, then the rent that the landlord has specified becomes payable. If the lease doesn't talk about time being of the essence, then there is no kind of restriction on time frame, and you can settle a rent review well after a rent review date, but the increase will be backdated to the rent review date. So as a tenant, you will continue paying the old rent, and if the rent increases and you don't settle the rent review for another 6 months, you'll then have to pay the difference between what you have been paying and what you should have been paying had the rent review being settled at the rent review date. So it's very much about negotiation, and ultimately when you reach agreement, it's important that the landlord and tenant document the agreed rent by way of a rent review memorandum. So it's a legal document that specifies that you've reached agreement, and that then is normally attached to the original lease, so that there can be no question at any future point that the rent was agreed at a fixed figure. So what happens if agreement can't be reached? And that it very often is the case. Well, again, the lease will specify what happens if the landlord and tenant can't agree the rent. And there are normally two routes that can be taken. One is arbitration and one is independent expert. Arbitration is where either the landlord and the tenant will apply to the President of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, which is the main surveying professional body here in the UK, and they will have a panel of arbitrators. They will normally appoint someone who's based in the locality of the subject property, who will take on the role of an arbitrator, and then the landlord and the tenant or their respective agents will put together their case supporting the rent that they are proposing should be paid on rent review. And in that case, you'll have to say what items you've actually managed to agree on, and then also evidence your comparable properties. So if you are basing your proposal on a letting that's taken place, you will need to get signed evidence of the terms of that letting for the arbitrator to be able to take it into consideration. So the arbitrator will have a submission from the tenant and from the landlord with their proposals, and they will make a decision based on the information within those proposals to determine the rent in accordance with the lease terms. The alternative to an arbitrator is an independent expert. Now, the parties can approach an independent expert, agree on an expert, or approach the RICS, who would have a panel of similar experts. And an independent expert is appointed to determine the rent, and they are, as the title suggests, independent. So whilst they will normally invite proposals, submissions from the landlord and tenant or their respective agents proposing what the rent should be, and they will take that into consideration, they will form a decision based on their expertise and knowledge. So they can take into consideration information that neither the landlord nor the tenant put forward, but they will make an independent decision to determine the rent. The lease might specify a time in which the matter is to be referred, so again be fully aware of what the terms say. So this brings me to the final point, which is with rent reviews it is absolutely critical to seek professional advice. And that is in terms of legal advice, but also surveying advice in terms of the value. One point which I haven't mentioned, which is quite important, is that the rent review clause that you saw at the start referred to the rent being reviewed to the either the rent passing or the market rental value, whichever is the greater. That's known as an upwards only rent review clause. Now, what happened with the last kind of property recession was that the market swung very much from being landlord dominated to tenants very much having the upper hand. So we saw lots of vacant property, properties becoming empty where tenant businesses were failing, and that's resulted in, with many leases today, having an open review clause where it's upwards downwards. So in that instance, at the rent review date, and again you need to be aware what the lease says, the rent would be reviewed to the market rent at the rent review date, whether that rent is higher than the current rent passing under the lease or lower than the current rent passing. Now, in such a scenario, from the tenant's viewpoint, it is really important that you would want to initiate that rent review quickly so that you are getting a reduced rent on rent review. Whereas from the landlord's viewpoint, they may be inclined not to initiate that rent review. So again, being fully aware of what's happened in the marketplace, fully aware of what the lease terms say, and being strategic and proactive and tactical about how you approach rent reviews. So that is why, going back to the final point on this last slide, I would say it's really important to seek professional advice. Okay, that's the end of this session.